And I grew up down in the Portland neighborhood, and there's nothing quite like Louisville. Having spent about 20 years out west and working for Navajo trading posts. My wife and I have been involved in that quite a long time. But before that, I was the research historian on the project to build the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience on Main Street, which was the first of the bourbon attractions on Main Street. And they built this beautiful speakeasy in the basement, and it really wasn't getting used a whole lot. And so I was looking for a job, and I suggested we do a program. And for 2 years on the weekends, I did Jake the Bartender and talked about the impact of Prohibition and the distill and the whole process. And it was really a fun time to do it, and it was interesting to see now all of these distilleries that popped back up on Whiskey Road, just where they belong. But we're going to talk today about the Prohibition, which they called the Noble Experiment. It was an experiment, all right. I'm not real sure about the nobility, but it was an amazing period in our nation's history, and there's never been anything quite like it, thank the Lord. No place was impacted by Prohibition as strongly as Louisville, Kentucky. It was devastating. It was estimated in 1920 when Prohibition became January the 16th, 1920, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the Volstead Act, was passed. Louisville lost 10,000 jobs that day. There were 25 distilleries here in town, something like 2,000 workers. Those were the distillers, the gaugers, the delivery people, all those jobs. There were about 1,000 people who worked in the cooperages, making the barrels. And if you don't have the barrels, you don't have bourbon whiskey. Those were highly skilled jobs and a very specialized skill. There were 12 breweries in town. About 900 people worked in those buildings. So all of these were really good, solid jobs people have had for years and knew their stuff. It wasn't just the brewers. There were the distillery guys, the delivery people, the sales people. All of those people all were out of a job suddenly. There were about 500 licensed taverns and saloons in Louisville at the time. Each one had 3 to 5 people typically, and most typically they were family-owned businesses. They weren't the big national franchises that ran bars. They were a family. This was their home. A lot of time lived above this place, and it was their substance. And it was cut out from under them, and it was devastating. Liquor stores closed, bars, stores, restaurants were impacted. All of this were just cut out suddenly, very, very suddenly. There's some seats up front here. So this is an interesting statistic you don't really think about, but about one third of the people that worked on the trains and the steamboats lost their jobs. Half of what we exported here was whiskey, and all those jobs just wiped out. So certainly more than 10,000 Louisvillians were affected, directly affected and also that had to do with farmers. Farmers raised the crops. A measure of corn in 1920, when Prohibition went into, $1 worth of corn by the time Prohibition was over in 1933 was worth 53 cents. It was devastating. Local corn, everybody just lost it. And God knows what, if you happened to raise hops, you were up a creek. So what happened? How did this all happen? How did Prohibition become a national thing? And it started very, very early. The first group that were really involved started in Connecticut in 1789, and they were called the teetotalers, which meant totally temperance. They were a loose organization. They were just people, virtually all Protestant, who said, oh, there's great evil. We do not like the idea of having liquor available. And a lot of this had to do with anti-immigrant feelings. There was a group in the 1840s. It was an interesting kind of group. They were the Washingtonian Pledge. They took the Washingtonian Pledge. It was started with 6 alcoholics that got together, and they focused on becoming sober, very much like AA. sort of early precursor. They were not against Prohibition. They didn't advocate Prohibition. They just, within 3 years, there were 600,000 members in the country. And they did all the ritual stuff that people used to do, like the Masons. They had costumes and they had secret handshakes and all these things. And it was a pretty powerful organization. In a lot of ways, it was a precursor to AA. And the interesting thing about naming it the Washingtonian Pledge to me is that after his administration as president was over, the largest distiller in the United States was George Washington. Just outside of Mount Vernon, he set up had a rye distillery. That was the American whiskey in those days, was rye. He produced 11,000 gallons of booze the year he died, 1799. His rye the mash bill was 65% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. But the real impact, the real political force that happened started in 1893, and it was called the Anti-Saloon League. And this became a very, very powerful, large and very powerful organization in the country. The Anti-Saloon League was strictly Prohibition. They were after every single thing. And their leading person, the person that was most identified, was a woman named Carrie Nation. And you probably heard about Carrie Nation with her axe, and she'd go with her hatchet, and she'd chop up saloons. The hatchet became the symbol of the Anti-Saloon League. They would wear a little lapel length. Now, it's an interesting fact that Carrie Nation was a Kentuckian. I'm sure we're all real proud of that. A lot of the anti-drinking was anti-Catholic. That was very, very pronounced. German Catholics, Germans especially, liked to have their beer on Sunday afternoon and dance and that did not fit in with the hardcore Protestant. The Irish, well, I'm Irish, we all know about us. Tomorrow being St. Virtually all the bars were either German or Irish, and the whiplash, went all the way back to the 1850s when you had the Know-Nothings in Louisville, which was a powerful force in the riot that they called, and the American Protective Association in the 1890s. Prohibition was a theory, a social theory, that if we got rid of the booze, we'd get rid of the drinking problems, which didn't really work out quite that way. But by 1930 to 1925, you started seeing 1920, you started seeing real movement, and a lot of that had to do with the First World War. In 1918, there was a war prohibition measure to save grain and energy for the troops. And that sort of became merged with the whole idea. A fellow named Volstead, Congressman Volstead, the Volstead Act, he produced the legislation, and it passed and went through the Supreme Court, and 3/4 of the states must ratify to ratify an amendment to the Constitution, which they did really pretty quickly. Most people did not obey the law. Once it was passed, they largely ignored it. People didn't agree with it and just didn't accept it very well. There was an elaborate network of illegal activities. There were the speakeasies, there was booze being, there were bootleggers, it was a huge moneymaker. And people were ignoring the law and laughing at it, to tell you the truth. But it set up a whole syndicate. And Louisville didn't have the gangs. We didn't have the Capones and things like that. But we sure had enough things going on. In 1925, in Bullitt County, the county judge was indicted for making whiskey. Out on LaGrange Road in 1925, there was a shootout in a barn on LaGrange Road with some revenuers, with some bootleggers. In 25, also 5 Louisville motorcycle cops were suspended because they were fooling around with the records and letting people off. And in fact, the national law, the Prohibition agents said that Louisville had a real problem with their police department, not enforcing. virtually all of us are old enough to remember a terrific restaurant called Cunningham's. Always my favorite restaurant in town. Cunningham's down on Fifth Street. It belonged to a fellow named Jimmy Cunningham. And you could always get a drink in Cunningham's. You had to go upstairs, in the little rooms upstairs. The restaurant still stayed open. You could always get a drink in Cunningham's. It operated quite openly. When Prohibition was repealed, the number one license number one in the city of Louisville, went to Cunningham's. Jimmy Cunningham, the owner, was also a police chief. I ain't saying, but as much as got going nationally in favor of Prohibition, locally there was some real opposition and important people. In 1888, there was an organization called the National Protective Association of the Wine and Spirit Trade. And it was led by a Louisvillian who was at the time the single largest distiller in the United States. His name was John M. Atherton. And we thought so much highly of him that we named a high school after his name. George Garvin Brown, who was the father of Brown Forman, in 1910, he was an extremely religious man, very, very active Presbyterian. He wrote a book called The Holy Bible Repudiates Prohibition. And he quotes every reference in the Bible when it comes to wine or strong drink, and then he defends each single time. And then he attacked the prohibitionists for wrapping themselves into religious self-righteousness. But the leading spokesman, without question, opposing Prohibition in not just Louisville, but nationally, was Morris Henry Waters, who was the editor of the Courier. And a very influential character, a fabulous character. And one of the things he wrote in 1909 was, Prohibition is not only wrong in principle, but an impossibility. And will be an impossibility as long as God decrees that trees bear fruit and fields yield grain. For every man has a natural right to grow fruit and grain. And from part of that, they shall elect to make fermented wines and liquors. It's a privilege no man can deny, and no man can successfully prevent. He very clearly said, Prohibition inevitably is a blunder. Prohibition does not prohibit. It merely breeds new vices. Another thing that he did, I think is one of the most noble things that Morris Henry Waterson ever did, was he came up with the greatest recipe for the mint julep that's ever been devised. He said, pluck the mint gently from its bed, just as the dew of the evening is about to form on it. Select the choicer sprigs only, but do not rinse them. Prepare the simple syrup and measure out a half tumbler of whiskey. Pour the whiskey into a well-frosted silver cup. Throw the ingredients away and drink the whiskey. I don't blame him at all. So 1918, when the First World War was, America was getting involved in the First World War. It was a grain. The idea was to save grain and to make it part of the war effort. And at that time also, you had a lot of anti-German sentiment in this country. And Louisville's about 1/3 German, ethnically, mostly German Catholics. You had things like they were renaming hamburgers Salisbury steak. Sauerkraut was then called Liberty cabbage. You had this anti-German feeling. But even before Prohibition went into effect, there were 100 of the 120 counties in Kentucky were already dry. They were local options, which is, we still have local options in the state. And so any community could vote to be dry, and many, many were. There was a point in Kentucky history, oddly enough, when Bourbon County was dry and Christian County was wet. Well, it sort of looked like Carrie Nation on our heads. But the Volstead Act was passed in 1919. It was a continuation of the war effort and became official on January 16, 1920. And it passed through the Supreme Court and it defined intoxicating beverages. That's the basic law. Intoxicating beverages were defined as something that was more than 0.5% alcohol. That's one proof. It could not be more than 1 proof alcohol. Possession was not illegal. The sale, production, and transport of liquor was illegal. But if you could have a wine cellar full, it was legal, as long as you bought it before Prohibition. And the week before Prohibition, people were, the liquor stores were going out of business, and they were selling stuff at 50 cents a bottle, just to get rid of it, and people were stocking up. That was legal. You could have that. Possession was not against the law. Whiskey was used in a lot of products back in those days. Lots and lots and lots of medicines used whiskey as their solvent, their base. The most popular American drug in the 19th century was laudanum. Laudanum was whiskey and opium put together. But without question, for older women, especially our grandmothers and great-grandmothers, their favorite thing in the afternoon was to have a little glass of what was called Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. Just made them sort of relax and serve their nerves. It was 38 proof. Grandma was not feeling much pain. Pastors, priests, rabbis, they could all buy wine for sacramental purposes. That was still legal. But perhaps the biggest use certainly was industrial use, but there was medicinal alcohol. You could be prescribed. You could go to your doctor, and they could write you a prescription, usually $3 to go to your drugstore, and you could get 1 pint every 10 days. Now, there was never been a legal. This was so abused that there were doctors writing hundreds of prescriptions a week, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and it was kind of winked at, but the pharmacy became the source of legal alcohol. And I think of all of the distilleries, the only one that produced whiskey before, during, and after Prohibition was Brown-Forman, because there was a strategic reserve of alcohol that you couldn't fall below, sort of like our oil, and they had to keep restocking that for the medicines and for the industrial use too. Well, it became evident that this was not really a great idea. It didn't work very, very well. There were police problems all over. There were raids all over the city. And there were raids, and there was especially coming across from Indiana. There was a lot of booze coming in through Detroit, Canadian whiskey coming in through Detroit and Chicago, and they were intercepting it on the K&I Bridge. There were police regular. There were people crossing the river in rowboats down by Shawnee Park. There were places all over that were being raided. Every neighborhood had a place, but perhaps the most interesting place that got raided in 1930 was the Pendennis Club. One Saturday afternoon, the cops showed up and they raided the place. They sealed the doors. They wouldn't let anybody out. That lasted for about 3 minutes. And a phone call was given, and you had probably half the judges and elected officials in the city were in there at the time. But they went through, and the agents cleaned out. They arrested a manager for selling booze. They were just selling it straight out of the place. There were lots of mixtures too. They said you could go in and get any sort of blends anytime you wanted at the Pendennis Club. But of all places, that got hit hard. Crime really took off, as I said. The impact on taxation was stunning. You can imagine how much money this was generating. Still, the main source of revenue for Kentucky is the whiskey distilleries. They finally decided it couldn't go, and FDR made in 1932 his first election a lot of emphasis on repealing Prohibition, and that got rolling, and finally on December the 5th, 1933, Prohibition was ratified. The 21st Amendment of the Constitution was ratified on that date. And the state that ratified, the three-fourths state, was of all places Utah. Now, having spent the last 8 of the last 10 years in Utah, I find it's kind of hard to imagine, except that I remember that Utah has nothing but state liquor stores. The closest one to where we live was 50 miles away. They were a little box unit. But Kentucky did not vote to repeal for another 2 years. But there were already an enormous number of places that were already dry and stayed dry. The county, it was a local option, and it stayed dry. But finally, the 21st Amendment, its only duty, it's a 2-sentence amendment. It repeals the 18th Amendment. That was it. The impact on Kentucky was almost immediate. Within 2 years, there were 9,000 people back at work. Before Prohibition, there were 75 distillers in Kentucky. Afterwards, there were about 40. And the small ones got bought up by the big guys. Seagram's, Shenley, and National Distillers bought up a lot of the small distilleries. It cost a lot of money to get a distillery go back up and get going again. And you didn't have a product for 4 years. So it was, you had to plan ahead. You had to have deep pockets to get a distillery started. But they did. And within 2 years, they were producing $9 million a year in salaries and $3.8 million in taxes for the city of Louisville. So Prohibition was actually paid off very, very well in the long run for Kentucky. You couldn't take away this major industry from us and help us to survive. This might not surprise anybody, but the last state to ratify Prohibition was Mississippi. And remember, it was Prohibition ended in 1933. In Mississippi, it ended in 1966. It took a long time, as you can imagine. But as far as I'm concerned, there was an unknown Mississippi state senator who summarized Prohibition and the dry, wet, dry battle better than anybody ever has. And it's worth remembering his words. When he was asked, this person was asked what they felt about whiskey. He said, "If when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, yea, literally takes the bread from the mouths of little children. If you mean the evil drink that topples the Christian man and woman from the pinnacles of righteousness, gracious living, and the bottomless pit of degradation and despair, shame and helplessness and hopelessness, then certainly I'm against it with all my powers. But if when you say whiskey, you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the stuff that that is consumed when the good fellows get together, that puts a song in their hearts and a laughter on their lips and warm glow of contentment in their eyes. If you mean Christmas, cheer, if you mean the stimulating drink that puts the spring in the old gentleman's step on a frosty morning, if you mean the drink that enables a man to magnify his joy and his happiness and to forget, if only for a little while, life's great tragedies and heartbreaks and sorrows. If you mean the drink that pours into our treasuries untold millions of dollars, which are used to provide tender care for our little children, our blind, our deaf, our dumb, our pitifully aged and infirm, to build highways, hospitals, and schools, then certainly I'm in favor of it. This is my stand. I will not retreat from it. I will not compromise. I feel just the same way as he did. I can't argue with that kind of logic. It was an interesting time. It was a time of great turmoil and turned society upside down. It was called the Noble Experiment. It was certainly a social experiment, not like anything else we've ever done. Remember, the 18th Amendment is the only amendment that's ever been done away with. And it's had a huge, huge impact on this community. We would not have a nice place like this today, legally. They were around, but they weren't legal. And personally, I'd like to thank these nice folks at TEN20. This is really a nice facility. They're very generous to let us use this for free today. And if you're going to hang around, may I suggest that you remember to tip your server. Now, as far as I'm concerned, when we're done here, I'm going to go out and exercise my legal rights under the 21st Amendment. Get a beer. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, what you had at the end, it makes me think of that remark that Hunter Thompson made about, he says, I would never advocate drugs or alcohol or any of those kind of things, even though they worked out fine for me.
Well, I'm not a local boy, but it will. Anybody else have any questions?
Other questions?
Well, thank you all for coming today.
Wait a minute. Carl has a question.
I actually have a couple of comments. So some may remember that the owner of National Distilleries was Otto Watson, and his son, Dick Watson, they lived in Indiana. Shortly before Dick and his wife moved back to Louisville, they invited some friends over to observe see the old house that's since burned. And someone pointed out this unusual space that seemed to be dead in the second floor and the winding staircase. It just didn't seem to make any sense. And Dick pointed out that that's where their family stash of booze was stored during Prohibition.
So that was perfectly legal.
Yeah.
The possession was, you could own as much as you could prove that you bought before.
But they also had medicinal alcohol license. The other one was that the quartermaster depot had a large supply of alcohol for industrial purposes.
Oh yeah.
And they had trouble with the people who were guarding that.
Well, one of the reasons we have Rivertown in Louisville was during the war, Second World War. We needed alcohol to produce gunpowder and a lot of other industrial uses. And so they wanted it far enough inland, they wanted this production far enough inland that they would not be available for German or Japanese attack. And so they placed it here in Louisville. And because we were producing so much alcohol, they put it out what would become Rivertown. Neoprene plant, the DuPont neoprene plant, because of the alcohol. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first one is, I constantly hear stories about Whiskey Row between First and Second, maybe Brook, that there were a lot of speakeasies back then in that area during Prohibition. That's like you commented.
The Whiskey Row is not because they produce so much whiskey up and down that street. They do today, far more than ever before. It was because that's where the companies were located. That's where the tasting rooms were. That's where the wholesaling was done. And so Whiskey Row, really the whole stretch of downtown Main Street, had different kinds of whiskey, or different kinds of food, but it wasn't that they were producing it there. Shively was where most of the whiskey, when I was growing up, was produced. And Shively exists because they moved right outside of the city limits of Louisville and avoided a lot of taxes. So Seagram's was the largest distillery in the world, but you had Four Roses, you name it. I mean, out on Ralph Avenue, Yellowstone, everything was out there.
But were they, a lot of them, were some of them still selling liquor during Prohibition?
No.
They weren't?
No, they were gone. They were out of business. Except those who were dealing with the medicinal. But there were only 6 distilleries. A lot of them, they just had their inventory and they sold it off. They weren't producing new during Prohibition. Brown-Forman did produce during Prohibition. Greatly reduced.
Second question I have, do you know much about George Remus? It was like the king of the bootleggers, as they like to refer to him. Did he ever buy any or own any distilleries here in Louisville?
I don't think, no, he was a bootlegger. He did. Remus was a fascinating character. Remus was the Great Gatsby. And the whole thing of Great Gatsby was that young lieutenant in the First World War, Fitzgerald was an alcoholic, and he was sitting in a sealback bar one day, and the guy next to him was George Remus. And they started talking, and Remus was the inspiration. In fact, Great Gatsby starts in what's clearly the Sealback Hotel. They changed the name, but it's clearly the Sealback. And Remus is telling the story. Rebus threw these fabulous, unbelievable, he made so much money. He was from Cincinnati. He made so much money, it was just astounding. He threw a party for 100 couples, 100 friends, rich folks. And each one of the men were given a diamond stick pin, and each of the women were given an automobile. So that was that's what inspired that kind of over-the-top Gatsby-like lifestyle. There's a whiskey now they named Rebus, which I find interesting. Legal whiskey.
When I did the research for my nightclub PowerPoint, I came across a piece, I don't know if it was early Courier or what, that the epicenter of resistance to Prohibition took place right up the street here at the Bellwood Tavern. That even the police were afraid to go in there and break up the alcohol.
Well, they weren't just afraid to do so, there was an incentive not to do so. The police had operated pretty wide open in those days. And they were strictly political jobs. This was the age of Mickey Brennan and Miss Lenny McLaughlin in the little pub. This was when Irish Democrats ran the city. And they worked out some accommodations. This way.
What are the industrial uses of alcohol?
Oh, you use it in all sorts of different solvents. You use it in manufacturing fertilizers and gunpowder. It's used in a lot of rubber, artificial rubber, things like that. Just enormous numbers of amount of use.
So it's my reading, I saw that one of the distilleries closest to rubber now, maybe national distilleries, actually had pipelines from rubber now. The plant that ultimately became Roman Haas back at that time took that alcohol and made people dying at least. I worked on one of the plants down there. We made synthetic rubber, not needle, but nitrile. That was one of our raw materials. Presumably that came from that plant that ultimately became Roman Haas. Now,
Oh, that became one more.
now it's down.
Yeah.
But I thought that was fascinating. It was actually a pipeline.
One of the most important laws ever passed in this country in 1897 was before the Pure Drug and Drug Act. It was the Bottled and Bond Act, and it was the first time when legal standards were set for whiskey. At that point, whiskey is whatever you want to call it, and most typically, it was not this aged bourbon we know. It was a new make. It's just fresh out of the still, and they colored it and flavored it. They put in iodine. They would put in tea. You would name it. Prunes, anything that turned. But the Bottled and Bond Act set the legal standards for what constitutes a legal bourbon. Must be 4 years old. Must be in a new white oak barrel. It must be 4 years old for bourbon, 2 years for rye. And very strong, but that was the very first time the government ever set legal standards for medicinal beverages.
Okay, without further ado, thank you again, Rick, for
Thank you, guys.
very informative.